Tonight on Dispatches, the extraordinary story of what's happened to the millions meant to improve our schools and health service.
Frustrated, really. I just think it's a poor use of public funding, and it's not even effective.
Millions of pounds of your money are making big business even richer.
It's a rip-off. It's a rip-off.
How much does it cost to change a light switch? In one of our biggest hospitals, £333. How much taxpayers' money to run this empty school? £52,000 a month, including meals which nobody's eating.
Unisex wash area.
The cost of refitting these school toilets, £25,000 down the drain in fees to men with clipboards.
Would have cost us £85,000 when we...
And when this head teacher wanted to modify her staff room, the bill to taxpayers doubled overnight. The government promised us a new generation of schools and hospitals, and they're delivering. Gordon Brown did it by getting private companies to borrow the money for lots of shiny new public buildings. Welcome to PFI, the Private Finance Initiative. With New Labour's blessing, PFI's grown from almost nothing to become a powerful industry, worth £4 billion a year. But there are some astonishing hidden costs.
They don't have to be too detailed because I've got a lot of thoughts myself.
I'm Liam Halligan, a journalist and economist. Tonight on Dispatches, I'll reveal how New Labour's big idea is making a handful of businesses exceedingly rich, while draining millions of pounds from our schools, hospitals and other public services. Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital, one of the first off the PFI production line. Built on time and on budget, it was the toast of New Labour. It even got the royal seal of approval.
By world standards, this is a world-class hospital campus. It could have been built cheaper, there's no doubt about that. On the other hand, the risk of building the project was passed over to the private sector, and the history of building projects in the public sector has not been a happy one.
So far, New Labour's approved almost 700 PFI projects, schools, hospitals, roads and airports across the UK. As each new project appeared, so too did ministers, keen to lap up the kudos.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be with you here today in what is a magnificent new hospital.
But the realities of PFI are now emerging, realities uncomfortable for the government, and some of the first signs of trouble were at this groundbreaking hospital.
This year that we've now got into, we are projecting a significant deficit, which we are tackling, and we think we can bring down very significantly during the year. Nevertheless, we calculate that because we are the first PFI hospital, and we're paying a premium because of that, that is probably costing us an extra £5 million a year.
What does PFI mean? Well, private investors borrow cash, put up public buildings and get a contract to run them, usually for 30 years. Taxpayers fork out hefty annual fees, and in the end the building becomes public property. It means far less debt on the government's books, but is it good value? And where does all the money go? When the government wants to borrow money, it gets the cheapest loans because the government always pays up. But PFI companies are a bigger risk, so it costs them much more to borrow for a new school or hospital, a cost they pass on to us.
The hospital trust will pay at least 4 to 5 times the construction cost in the form of rent over the life of the contract.
So this is a hospital facility that cost around 230 million, and they're going to end up paying 4 to 5 times more than that?
Yeah, at least. Something like 950 million they'll end up paying.
In taxpayers' money?
Yeah.
That sounds like a terrible deal.
It's a rip-off. It's a rip-off.
The Norfolk and Norwich was built by Octagon Healthcare, a consortium including a little-known company called Innisfree. In a few short years, Innisfree's risen to own almost 300 schools and hospitals. The company's driving force? This man, David Mehta. A South African, he became a British citizen back in the 80s. PFI's made him rich and influential. A respected voice, say ministers. He's also the industry's spokesman.
Innisfree is an investor in PFI projects, and we provide the opportunity for large institutional investors such as pension funds and insurance companies to invest in PFI assets.
Now, I've read that you are the biggest owner of schools and hospitals in this country after the state. Is that true?
That's probably correct.
And are you proud of that fact?
We are. We have a large infrastructure platform now, and we are now very actively involved in these projects, the health projects and the education projects and various other projects that we have to ensure the projects work well and deliver the services for which we're getting paid.
But they're cleverer than that. The Norfolk and Norwich presented David Mehta and Octagon Healthcare with a chance to boost their profits at your expense. Banks worry about the risks of complicated projects like Norfolk Hospital, so the private companies involved pay high rates of interest. But once such buildings are up and running, the whole thing becomes less risky. So David Mehta and Octagon pick their moment, then swap their original loan for a cheaper form of borrowing. It's known as refinancing, and it's a shortcut to huge profits. On this one project, refinancing made £116 million, enough to pay for a whole new hospital.
After the refinancing, Octagon Healthcare, which is the company involved, are making 60% return on capital employed.
A year?
Yeah.
60%?
If you go into a building society and get, 4 or 5%, 6% of deposits, they're making 60% return on capital employed.
How would you describe that?
Disaster. Not for Octagon Healthcare, it's wonderful for them. But for the shareholders of Octagon Healthcare, it's a dream. But for the trust and the taxpayers, it's a disaster, it seems to me.
It was a PR disaster at least. The highly respected Public Accounts Committee branded the deal the unacceptable face of capitalism. Eventually, Innisfree and its partners were pressured into giving some of their profits back. But they still kept £80 million, more than 70% of the refinancing windfall.
We had to accept higher termination payments if the deal all fell through during the course of the contract. And we extended the contract from 30 to 35 years in order to get that 30% share. It was not a gift at all by the private equity providers. It was the best we could get in a difficult negotiation.
David Mehta rejects the idea that companies like Innisfree are exploiting the public sector.
What is always highlighted is the gains the private sector make out of this refinancing, not the shared gains we make with the public sector. And if you go to probably every one of those NHS hospitals that have shared in gains, they will have done it very, very enthusiastically.
That's because a small share is better than nothing at all. And things have got worse at the Norfolk. Facing big PFI payments, the hospital now has a £15 million deficit. Cuts have been made, staff outraged. And remember, the PFI company made a windfall of £80 million, enough to pay 400 nurses for 10 years.
I think if they were prepared to give back some of that money, I think it would change the whole feeling toward PFI in Norfolk. And the tragedy of this is that we have this fantastic new hospital, and yet people in Norfolk, all they can think of is that the PFI private financial backers have made off with a sackload of money.
Another brand new hospital, another PFI deal involving Innisfree and David Mehta. This is Darrant Valley in Kent, again a PFI trailblazer. When it opened, the then Health Secretary Alan Milburn was on hand for the applause. Here too, on the surface, it all looked rosy.
If it hadn't been PFI, we wouldn't have got it. And I must say, when it was first proposed, I thought it would never happen. And it happened. The other thing that one could say about PFI is because they want to get their money back as fast as possible, it went up and was built and functioning in a staggeringly fast time.
The honeymoon didn't last. Behind the scenes, David Mehta and his partners used the same manoeuvre which shocked staff at the Norfolk. They refinanced the deal and walked away with almost £22 million. Again, the hospital itself was soon in trouble, facing job cuts and a £4 million deficit.
What I minded was the fact that they seemed to have creamed off such a staggering amount of money in a short time, and I was appalled by the fact that all that money has just vanished into the private sector and could have been used in the public sector.
The PFI investors returned some of the cash after lengthy negotiations. They handed over 35%, but extracted a price.
Although it extended our payback and reduced our annual payback, it was at a huge cost to the taxpayer, and therefore you and me.
In the early days of PFI, ministers were desperate not to offend the private sector. They rejected the idea of forcing companies to share these windfall gains. Under pressure, the Treasury eventually tried using a gentleman's agreement, a voluntary code, to get taxpayers a slice of the cash.
I'm driving along the A69 near Newcastle, built by a consortium called Roadlink under PFI. They made around £1 million from refinancing. The exact figure remains confidential. So what of that gentleman's agreement to actually share those profits?
Roadlink decided it wouldn't share its refinancing gains. The company simply refused, and there was nothing the government could do about it. So much for partnership.
There's more. Another PFI road scheme in Staffordshire made big refinancing gains. So did one in Dorset. These schemes, refinanced after the gentleman's agreement, made £5 million between them and kept the lot, with the approval of the Highways Agency. Eventually, the Treasury said future PFI contracts would have to include a share of refinancing gains. So just how much has the PFI industry made from refinancing? How much have taxpayers lost? I found the answer buried in a report by the National Audit Office, the parliamentary watchdog which monitors government finance.
Their figures show that so far, the PFI industry's made a staggering £264 million from refinancing deals. Taxpayers only £137 million. But the industry's returns don't stop there. When a company signs up to build a school or hospital, it generally gets a contract to run the place too, often for 30 years or more.
These contracts can run to thousands of pages, a lawyer's bonanza paid for by you. Every possible task is written down and priced. It's another golden opportunity to divert money from frontline services. At Darrant Valley Hospital, staff were dumbfounded when they learnt the PFI company charged £200 to hang a mirror and £420 to fit a plug socket.
You just know that when there's a middleman and a private company and there's a whopping charge for every little trivial bit of maintenance, that it's not value for money. It's blatantly obvious. You know, when you get, as we were early on, told, you know, you mustn't nail any pictures on the wall, you mustn't stick anything on the walls, mainly because they're cardboard, you know, without consulting with Carillion so that they could put in a charge. All this money that's flooded into the health service, very little of it seems to have got through to actual patient care. There's a lot of extra staff, and luckily there are extra doctors and nurses, but there are a hell of a lot of people with clipboards.
It drives you demented. You just want to, sometimes you think it's all lunacy. These are simple things that ought to be done simply.
In part two, it's not just the NHS. How some of our schools and teachers are coping with PFI. Highland School, North London. The head teacher, Monica Cross, describes the private finance initiative as lunacy. She feels it's time to blow the whistle. This school was among the first to be built under PFI. Just 5 years ago, it was all going so well. Tony Blair himself dropped in to open Monica's school.
And what was it like to have the Prime Minister here opening the school?
It was really good. It was a really good experience with the students, and it was quite exciting because PFI was a really big new thing then, and we were really in favour. We thought it was going to be something smashing that would, be the way things were in the future. So we were very positive at the beginning.
Highlands School's an educational success, but it's the mundane running of the buildings which takes up too much of Monica's time. Her life's dominated by the school's labyrinthine PFI contract.
Here is the local authority.
Okay. Yeah.
And they have a contract with what we will now call the SPC, and that's like the special project company, and they're the ones that have the contractual relationship with each other.
Yeah.
Here's us. This is the school.
Yeah.
We don't have anything to do with that contract. We have a different relationship through the local authority.
Right.
The special project company, they now subcontract all of the responsibilities within the contract to a facilities management company.
Yeah.
They, in turn, now subcontract again to other contractors for, if you like, S for services. So they'll have a cleaning company and the school meal service and the maintenance, and all of those things are all off here. If we have a problem with the cleaning company, we can't go straight to the cleaning company and say, we think you've left the place dirty. We have to go through this process here. One of the problems we are hoping to do something about is this. This is the main school office. As you can see, if you come to reception, you can see all the way through. We want to just enclose that, put a partition wall up. We want to make a little meeting room, a private meeting room, so that parents can come into the school and have somewhere private that they can talk to members of staff or senior staff about their children.
Do you want to show me?
Yeah.
A head teacher asks for a few small changes. Her school already pays Equion, its PFI company, almost £1 million a year. But even for this simple job, Equion cranks up the charges even more. A local builder initially quoted Monica around £18,000, but Equion had to approve it. They then added their own fees, pushing the cost to £37,000. So the school's bill had more than doubled.
Send.
Monica learnt the hard way. When you're tied into PFI, you can't get competitive quotes. Everything goes through the PFI company, and everything costs.
Frustrated, really. I just think it's a poor use of public funding. And it's not even effective, it's not efficient, and it costs a huge amount of money. And that's terrible.
During the last election, Tony Blair returned to Highlands to give the school his seal of approval.
I'm not sure that when this whole process started, the politicians themselves actually realised what the consequence of any of this would be. There seemed to be some kind of naivety, because it was all a talk of partnership, wasn't it? Partnership means you've got to have some kind of shared objective, and there isn't a shared objective. The objective on one side is a commercial organisation whose desire is to spend as little as possible on delivering what they have to deliver and to maximise the profit for the shareholders. And on the other side, you've got people like us, schools, that want to use every penny of the money that they get in the best possible way for the teaching and learning of the students. So it's totally incompatible, and it always was.
Equion told us.
The company was awarded the contract on the basis that we represented good value for money. The total price for the proposed staff kitchen and meeting room was estimated at £37,000, including allowances for project management and statutory work. There was no administration charge.
After 6 years, Monica had enough of PFI and is off to work somewhere else. But it's not just head teachers who move on.
We've discovered that the ownership of growing numbers of PFI projects is changing hands too, being bought and sold as commodities in the City of London. And a lot of money's being made.
Even my local train route has changed hands. Part of the London Docklands Light Railway PFI was sold on for £16 million, giving private sector investors a 500% return. Local councils had also invested millions, but they got nothing, because the Treasury says companies can keep all their profits when PFI projects are sold on. So who benefits? when the contract for a local hospital or school is cashed in. Ingleby Barrack, one of Europe's biggest private housing estates, is short of school places. So every day, 700 children face a long journey.
What worries me is the lack of secondary school places on a private new housing development of 6,600 houses now and 8,000 houses when it's completed in 3 or 4 years' time. We have a 600-place secondary school, which is a fantastic school, but it's not big enough for all the children who want to attend it on this estate.
Ingleby Barrack was one of several schools owned by a PFI consortium, then sold on to investors in the city. One consortium partner made more than £1 million, having invested just a year before. Parents and staff at the school only learnt of this sale after it happened.
How do you feel about the fact that a huge windfall's been made and none of that money has been shared?
I'm very grateful initially to that investor for investing, and I have no problem with people making a return on their money. I don't think anybody has, but I would certainly welcome a slice of that to be put back into the school or into an extension to the school so that I can get the children off here educated on Ingleby Barrack and not elsewhere.
The Treasury says the sale of PFI projects like Ingleby Barrack is none of its business, nor is it demanding a share of the profits, which is just as well, because PFI companies say they won't pay up. So how much are they making? Well, the city's predicting profits from these sales could reach an extraordinary £1.5 billion by the end of next year. But David Mehta, the industry spokesman, says that's fine.
If we, for example, sell our shares in an underlying project to a new purchaser, those gains will be subject to capital gains tax, and that is a sharing arrangement. That is the Inland Revenue taking 30% of the gains.
It's not only the sellers who gain. Those buying the contracts can make money from taxpayers too. After all, a PFI contract provides a regular, fixed income from government. So if the new contract holders can get away with spending less on actual services, they can keep more money for themselves.
Varndene School near Brighton, renovated under PFI by one consortium, then sold on to a company called the Secondary Market Infrastructure Fund, or SMIF. A mere technicality for headmaster Andy Schofield, until maintenance began to slip.
So Liam, we'll go down and we'll have a look at some of the landscaping issues. I mean, look at that there. I mean, that's where there's 2 paving stones just missing. Two.
Sure.
And you can see from the work,
yeah,
it's not been built properly. I mean, look at that there. A kid did slide down this bit and cut their knee right through to the bone on a bit of metal that was sticking out. It isn't safe. I mean, the grass isn't cut. It needs all looking at. It's just lack of attention to detail.
18 months after Smith took over, the local council published an independent report into how PFI was working out. The conclusions were harsh. Varndene wasn't getting what it should under the contract, and neither, therefore, were the taxpayers.
This is a gas main. This is a main to half the school, okay?
Shouldn't that be in a brick
You might think
building
it should be in a slightly better cover than that. This thing here was only just been screwed onto. It was wide open up till a couple of weeks ago, and that handle in there will disconnect the gas for half the school. And at the weekend, a couple of weeks ago, somebody came on the site and switched the gas off to half the school, so we had no heating for most of the week.
And the gas has got to be reset.
Yes, it's not just like putting your pilot light back on. And you could get the top off, couldn't you, anyway? I mean, you can take the top off like that.
That's your gas main?
Yeah.
Smith's directors have positioned themselves as the coming men of PFI, buying up shares in public buildings, even part of the GCHQ Spy Centre.
I think Smith are trying to make as much money as they can out of the contract, and that's dependent on them not spending money here. So when I see no maintenance plan, no refurbishment plan, which is all in the contract, and it's supposed to all have been produced by now, I know why it's not coming, because it will all have a price attached to it.
Maintenance hasn't been the only problem. Under the original contract, these toilets were due to be rebuilt. When it didn't happen, Andy took matters into his own hands.
toilet. So supervised area there so that the kids don't mess around in here. Whole complex would have cost us 85,000 when we went out to tender for it. As soon as Smith got involved, went up to 110,000.
They just whacked an extra 25,000
Same spec, same builder, same tender, and it went up 25,000.
The PFI contract has been a drain on the headmaster's time for more than 4 years.
It's taken up enormous amounts of management time, made the students depressed to be in the school at times when they've seen the lack of interest in the building, because some of the quality of the new build's been so poor. We've had staff resign over it. We've had issues with health and safety. It's been extremely depressing, and it's amazing that the school's continued to improve its exam results and people have continued to come to work hopeful when that's all been going on around us.
We approached Smith for a comment, but they did not respond.
Any control from the point
But this former investment banker says the experiences of Varndine School are hardly surprising. As a Conservative MP, Richard Bacon has no qualms about businesses making money, but not at the expense of taxpayers.
You get better performance out of things in the vernacular in the city by making the assets sweat harder, by making either the people or the other resources you've got there do more for less.
So you buy a PFI contract in the secondary market, you get your fixed revenue from the government every month or every year, and you think you can deliver the services for less money, and that's how you make money.
Well, if you think you can do that and you did deliver them for less, you would make more money than you were expecting. And most people, you would think, wouldn't you, if they thought they could make more money than they were expecting, they would seek to do so. So there's always that incentive there to do that.
To cut corners.
Potentially to cut corners.
I took these concerns to this country's most senior public spending watchdog, the Auditor General.
Now, Sir John Bourne wouldn't talk to me on camera, but he has given me an extremely rare personal statement. The Auditor General says he too thinks the buying and selling of PFI shares poses important risks for the public sector. How does one know, he says, that the new owners of these contracts will provide as good a service as the original PFI partners? How do we know, he said, that those buying into PFI aren't just in it for a quick buck? So PFI companies make a killing at the expense of you, the taxpayer, by refinancing, by ramping up contract charges and cutting corners, and then by selling on their stakes for a tidy profit. And we've discovered some firms in these so-called public-private partnerships then add insult to injury by avoiding tax on those profits too.
HSBC, one of the world's biggest banks, is heavily involved in PFI. It set up a fund to buy schools, hospitals and other public buildings. Anyone can buy shares in this fund, so that's what I did. And believe it or not, part of the HSBC portfolio is the brand new headquarters of the Home Office.
Okay, so I've studied the prospectus, I've bought the shares, I now own a chunk of this building. You know, I never thought I could afford a place in central London, yet I've just landed a slice of Whitehall.
For decades to come, HSBC, a bank, will oversee maintenance, cleaning and other services here.
Now, while I was in my new Home Office abode, I discovered something in this prospectus which made me as a taxpayer rather worried, if rather happy as a shareholder. Apparently, this fund's going to seek to enhance the value of its investments by extracting upside benefits, by reducing costs, by extracting efficiencies, by checking adherence to contractual structures, and by scrutinising potential deductions.
This financial jargon implies HSBC may try to sweat contracts at the Home Office and the schools and hospitals they own. They'll make more money if they spend less on our public services. And where is this fund based? For tax purposes, not in the UK, but in Guernsey.
So here it is, the registered office of the fund, including my small slice of the Home Office.
Here in Guernsey, enormous investment funds need pay tax at only £600 a year. Directors of HSBC's £250 million PFI fund say they'll avoid UK tax status too.
So this is a fund that's driven by public money, but the public's not getting a share.
HSBC told us.
The investments in the UK pay UK tax. In common with other investment funds, HSBC Infrastructure Company Limited's tax status allows investors to make a collective investment without a double tax charge. The company's aim must be that its projects meet the required service standards over the long term and are managed efficiently.
Should projects driven by public money be avoiding tax, even if the loophole is legal?
Any sale of an equity stake is subject to tax in the normal course, capital gains tax. And in that way, there is a level playing field between people who choose to buy and sell shares in PFI companies or people who choose to buy and sell shares in Vodafone or in Shell. It creates a level playing field which is important for investors.
So none of the contracts are being sold offshore, no? There's no...
None of which contracts?
The PFI contracts.
I'm not sure. Most of the PFI contracts, the UK ones, are in the UK, and the companies that, the project companies are UK companies. Now, some of the shareholders might be offshore shareholders, but it's general in the UK to encourage offshore investors into this country.
David Mehta's company, Innisfree, owns state schools with more than 100,000 pupils and hospitals with 13,000 beds. How easy is it to find out what happens to all that public money? Just how transparent is PFI?
Well, I don't think it's secretive. I think it's very, very open. I think that most of the contracts can be reviewed on government websites. I think that there is a lot of government publications and private sector publications which cover PFI. I think there's no end of information that is available on the sector.
Dispatches decided to put that to the test. After the break, just what does the UK's biggest private owner of schools and hospitals do with its millions? I've been investigating how the government's programme to put up more public buildings has made fortunes for a new breed of investor. One of the largest is Innisfree, now the biggest owner of hospitals and schools outside the state. I've come to see a man who studies the tax structures buried in the accounts of big business. Meet Professor Prem Sikka. I set him to work on Innisfree's accounts.
The companies actually paid no corporation tax for year 2004 and 2005.
What?
That is despite a massive increase in its profits, £4.5 million in 1 year. But when we look at its cash flow statement, it says there is no payment for corporation tax. What that suggests is that for tax purposes, the company claims that it has accumulated some losses. So the paradox is it is telling its shareholders that there is a huge amount of profit, but for tax purposes, it says, sorry, we made losses, and for that reason, it is not paying tax.
Innisfree owns a large number of subsidiaries. The accounts show that millions and millions of pounds have been transferred to these minor companies.
Are those subsidiaries paying tax?
No, they are not paying any tax at all. Indeed, when you look at the accounts of subsidiaries, they appear to have no employees either, but they have a huge amount of income. If I look at just one of them in this case, Innisfree Partners, there is a turnover of 11.5 million
in a subsidiary,
and the operating expenses are almost the same, just over 11 million as well. And so
that wipes out the tax liability.
That's right. And one question anyone would want to ask is, what is the nature of these operating expenses? And when I look at the accounts, there are just two words: management fee.
And that's a pattern that's repeated across all the Innisfree subsidiaries we've looked at.
That is right. And it appears that the income is being transferred to the parent company, but there isn't really much information about as to what the nature of this management fee is. Who's getting it, why they're getting it, how they're getting it, we don't know.
And yet it's public money.
Absolutely right, yes.
Professor Sikka also looked at who owns Innisfree shares. The biggest individual holder is David Mehta, but more than a third of them are held outside the UK. I tracked them down to a Coutts Bank account in Jersey, another tax haven. And that means I can't find out who owns these shares, even though they represent a huge stake in our schools and hospitals.
There are really two main reasons for this. One is that Coutts could be concealing the identity of the real beneficiaries. The second reason perhaps relates to tax avoidance. So it is really a tax avoidance vehicle.
Legal?
It is absolutely legal. Whether it is moral and ethical, that is a separate issue altogether. I would argue that in this case, since it is the taxpayers' monies which are being distributed, we should have been told who exactly is benefiting from this.
David Mehta later told Dispatches that Innisfree is set up so its investors pay tax rather than the company itself. He says this isn't unusual, but he didn't comment on the shares held in Jersey. Now, if you or I went to a building society, we'd get maybe a 5% return on our money. The Treasury admits the average return for PFI investors is as much as 18%. But one private study of 8 such contracts found a return on capital of a staggering 123%.
And with the government locked into increasing numbers of long-term contracts, there's plenty for city investors to look forward to.
So far I've shown how New Labour has allowed private PFI companies to make hundreds of millions of pounds in windfall profits. But there's something else. Another way for the industry to make a killing at the public's expense.
Now, one thing that really worries me about PFI is that the state gets locked into really long-term contracts, 20 or 30 years or more. So I'm off to Scotland to see what such long-term contracts can actually mean in practice.
7 years ago, Inverness Airport was a sleepy backwater. Today it's part of the air travel boom, but it's cost taxpayers a small fortune. Inverness needed a state-of-the-art terminal, able to handle 1 million passengers annually. To the rescue came PFI.
When basically Inverness was operating out of a couple of porter cabins and a very rickety shed and dealing with about 300,000 passengers per annum. Now there was a need to do something, and the only deal at the time that was available was the PFI deal.
But the airport had to agree to pay the PFI company £3.50 for each passenger.
So every passenger that went through the terminal, you had to pay more and more to the PFI company. Now the charge at the end of last year was just under £1.9 million.
And it didn't stop there.
The PFI company took all the revenue from the car park. All the money made here in the terminal as well, that went to the PFI company too.
Everything went to the PFI company, so they received the money from the passenger charge, they received the revenues from the shop, the revenues from the cafeteria, everything.
This terminal cost £9 million to build. The bill under PFI, £73 million over 25 years. Some of this money was meant to come from landing fees, but then the budget airlines arrived and they pay much lower fees. Suddenly, there was a hole in the airport's budget, but taxpayers were still locked in to decades of expensive PFI payments. The only escape? To spend £35 million buying out the contract.
The airport's incredibly important for the region. It supports in the order of 2,500 full-time jobs. It generates between 120 and 130 million pounds per annum for the area. And that's why the deal was so incredibly important to get it done, so that we didn't have this constant black hole into which we were tipping money.
It's not only airports which have problems when things change. What happens when a PFI school's no longer needed? Throckley Middle School was redundant almost as soon as it was built. Newcastle Council decided it needed more schools for younger children, and 2 years after Throckley opened, it was closed. The council, though, is tied in to a 27-year PFI contract, and the PFI company still gets £52,000 a month of taxpayers' money.
Now, it's bad enough that a brand new school has been closed for more than a year. But what's really crazy is that because it's a PFI school, the local council still has to shell out thousands of pounds every month in taxpayers' money for maintenance, cleaning and catering services that aren't even being used. The company's currently being paid for services which essentially it isn't giving.
Yes, at the present moment in time. However, what's happening with the variation on the contract? Newcastle City Council has gone back to Focus, the provider of the school and the services, and said, we don't want to use the school in the way it was originally intended, we want to use it in a different way.
The council admits changing Throckley Middle School into a primary is harder under PFI.
The problem is, there was a contract signed before we became the administration here in Newcastle, which said that once the school opened, the costs over the next 25 years would be £52,000 a month.
Isn't that the problem?
That is a problem where you've got a variation. However, what we're trying to do is to negotiate our way through that variation of contract. Now,
made more difficult because it's a PFI?
It absolutely made more difficult. However,
doesn't that clip your wings slightly?
It makes things more complex.
PFI is then driving the policy rather than the other way around.
No, it makes things more complex, but what we'll be able to do is if we have a situation like this occurring in the future, let's say in 10 years' time, Throckley Middle School or another building which is PFI financed needs to change its use. We will have built up the experience on how to negotiate a variation in the future.
But the changing needs in education are nothing to the near constant revolution in the NHS. There are plenty of redundant hospitals in the UK. Will the new PFI building soon join them? Earlier this year, this London hospital was demolished. Built in the mid-70s, it closed 25 years later. Yet today's PFI contracts last 30 years or more. The leading source of independent research on the NHS is the King's Fund. It predicts PFI hospitals will soon face empty wards and greater costs.
There were no studies, no strategy. They just went ahead and built hospitals without regard to the wider context. The government now wants care shifted from hospital to community, undermining its own investment strategy.
So do you think we could see PFI hospitals closing?
There are already signs that's going to happen in one or two cases. They'll either close or be drastically reduced in scale.
Some people would say at least parts of those hospitals then are white elephants.
Well, they will become white elephants because it's very difficult to redeploy hospital activity into other things.
So how sensible are 30-year contracts when health policy itself is always changing?
It doesn't make sense to lock yourself into those contracts when you know you're going to have to shift course during that period.
But that's what PFI does.
I'm afraid it does, yeah.
But surely the PFI Industries delivered buildings of the highest quality. That's what New Labour promised, world-class public services. This 1970s hospital won design awards when it was built. 4 years ago, it was refurbished under PFI. Is this an inspiring building? The president of the Royal Institute of British Architects says not. He thinks PFI isn't up to the job.
This has been refurbished and extended under PFI. Tiny windows. It looks like a cheap porter cabin. The approach is through chain link fences with concrete bollards, and basically it looks like going to a barracks or a prison.
We're not going to refurbish this hospital again, are we, for another 30 years?
No, it's an opportunity lost. Each one of these projects are big projects. You don't get to do them again. You know, you don't buy hospitals for much under 100 million. So, you know, you've got to get them right.
A shoddy corridor in a PFI school. The government's own advisors judge that PFI's produced 9 out of the worst 10 schools built in the last 5 years.
You know, really, this is disrespectful to the students who are there. Poor daylighting standards, poor facilities. You know, they quickly look second-hand. This is a huge opportunity to get something right. And I'm worried that we're doing it in a flawed system when we could be doing it in a better system.
So why is New Labour so keen on PFI? Well, it brings short-term political gains. Ministers get the kudos of opening new buildings. And because much of the spending's off the government's books, Gordon Brown can maintain his long-held boast that he is a prudent chancellor.
Every pound that is inefficiently spent is a pound denied to our frontline services, to health, to education, to pensions. And our prudence and our responsibility is not therefore an abandonment of socialism, it is the very essence of it.
This year, the Chancellor confirmed a huge expansion of PFI, but it comes at a cost. Even the government admits PFI drives up the taxpayer's bill by almost a fifth. You don't have to be an expert to see this as financially unsound.
Given the current rates of interest, for every £1 that is borrowed, £7 need to be repaid back to these companies.
Over the length of these PFI contracts.
That's right. And that is a huge burden on the taxpayer. To put it another way, if another political party comes into office and it says, well, we are going to reduce taxes or we are going to invest more in X, Y, Z, it will have huge difficulty because these borrowings through the PFI would need to be taken into account, and the government is committed to that, and these contracts are virtually non-negotiable.
The Treasury says PFI plays a small but important part, some 10 to 15%, in total government investment. They told us,
authorities report that PFI services are provided in line with their contracts or better in 89% of projects. Transferring the risk of the cost overruns, delay in asset delivery and poor maintenance ensures the provision of services at minimal risk to the taxpayer.
for my money, PFI's like a shopping spree with an ultra-expensive credit card. Ministers have so far signed deals worth £43 billion, but the future repayments will be far higher.
The bill's already £150 billion. That's equivalent to the government's entire annual income tax revenue. And as new PFI schemes get the go-ahead and more of those hidden costs emerge, that taxpayer's bill can only go up.
Passing on costs to future taxpayers is just too tempting for today's politicians. Ministers have just announced the specifics of 200 more PFI schemes, including roads, schools and hospitals. Innisfree have just signed a deal to rebuild St Bart's Hospital in London, the biggest NHS contract yet. And David Mehta and his fellow directors have just awarded themselves an extra £10 million in pay.